Top Med Talk.
Welcome to Top Med Talk. I'm Kate Leslie and I'm here at Anaesthesia 2025, the annual meeting of the European Society of Anaesthesiology and Intensive Care in Lisbon in Portugal. And I'm lucky enough to be here with Monty Mythen, our Emeritus Editor-in-Chief. Hello, Monty.
Kate, great to be here. Great to be back in the seat, allowed back in, Top Med Talk. One of my favourite children.
Even your most favourite child?
No, you're steady now. I've got 4 wonderful children. The real ones are more important than Top Med Talk. But you know what, I've got myself into a lot of trouble there, haven't I? Straight off the
bat, but that's why we love having you back on Top Med Talk. You're now have moved to BD.
Yeah, so I moved to Edwards Critical Care as was. I was out in America doing a sabbatical after I stepped down from the chair at University College London of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care. While I was out there, they offered me the job, and I sort of had a sense that there was stuff going on. And then after a few months, we were acquired by BD, Becton Dickinson, and we are now BD APM, Advanced Patient Monitoring.
Sounds great, and I hope you're having a great time. It's certainly here having a great time at the meeting in Lisbon.
Yeah, so this is a wonderful, wonderful meeting.
Excellent. Well, we're very lucky to have one of the speakers from the meeting here.
Hello.
Today on Top Med Talk. It's Chiara. Can you introduce yourself?
I can. Hello. Thank you very much. I'm Chiara Robba. I come from Genova. I am a neurointensivist, head of the neuro ICU in Genova, in Italy. And well, I do both neuro and general ICU and also neuroanesthesia and general anesthesia. So I try to do my best.
And you've come here to give a talk, I believe, about cerebral autoregulation.
Yes, one of my main topic in general is autoregulation. I did my PhD on that, so I have to talk about it.
What were the highlights of your PhD? What did you find?
Basically, not much, like for every PhD.
That's very honest. Very honest.
It's very honest. No, we did a sort of a multimodal monitoring study in different types of patients, both in the perioperative settings and in the ICU. I think that the major point that we found with this PhD is that even in apparently healthy patients, you might have altered autoregulation. Like we did some studies in patients undergoing shoulder surgery, which are healthy, young most of the times. We found so many altered autoregulations, and there is a correlation with postoperative delirium, etc. Same thing in the ICU. Even septic patients, they have altered autoregulation, and then when they wake up, they have delirium or cognitive dysfunction. So I think it's a bit underestimated as an issue, probably because it's beautiful from a physiological point of view. People think it's difficult to apply it at bedside, but I don't think so.
So can you remind our listeners of the beautiful physiology of autoregulation in normal people?
Yeah. So the brain is able to protect itself. So despite the changes of arterial blood pressure that occur every day, all the day, the brain is able to maintain constant the cerebral blood flow. So for instance, when we have an hypertensive peak, because we get very agitated because we need to give a talk at the ESAIC, for instance, there is a reaction of vasoconstriction, cerebral vasoconstriction, which maintain constant the cerebral blood flow. On the other hand, when we have a reduction in the arterial blood pressure, we have a vasodilation to maintain it. It's a sort of, when you wake up in the morning and you stand up very quickly, your blood pressure goes down and you see a little bit black. Well, that's the moment when your autoregulation is trying to work.
Excellent. And so you've moved on to pathological autoregulation.
Yeah.
Are there various different syndromes of?
Yes, the problem is that when we study autoregulation in our books of physiology, we know that there is a range that generally is from 50 to 150 millimeter of mercury of CPP, which is where autoregulation works. The problem is that in brain-injured patients, but even in not primarily brain-injured patients, this difference is much shorter. And the other thing is that it's different from patient to patient, and it changes in the same patient from time to time. So for the same patients or different patients, you don't know if the blood pressure that you are giving him is good or not good. And when I mean good or not good, I mean something which is related to the outcome of the patient, because if I keep the pressure too much low, so lower than the lower limit of autoregulation, the effect is a cerebral ischemia. If I keep it too high, I give them a hemorrhage edema. So it's a realistic problem.
There's also another piece, which is you say, I'm giving the patient a particular blood pressure. Does it matter how you achieve that blood pressure? For example, if you achieve it just by waiting and the patient naturally gets a better blood pressure, are they in a better state than one where you achieved it with a vasopressor, or one where you achieved it with an inotrope, or one where you achieved it with fluid?
It's not always feasible to wait for the patients to achieve the pressure that you want, because you have to think that the time is brain. So if you are not good in maintaining a good cerebral blood flow, in that moment you are having cerebral damage. So you don't have the time to wait. You have to do something, which can be decide, measure which is your target and try to achieve it. Of course, you take some risks in this. For instance, some patients need fluids, vasopressors, and of course, this is a risk for the systemic part of the body for the patient. So you have to find a balance, I think, between treating and having an equilibrium.
So you mentioned a few examples or scenarios where autoregulation could be abnormal. Can we start with a relatively straightforward one, which is the patients you mentioned undergoing shoulder surgery?
Yeah.
And I'm going to assume you're talking about patients who are in the so-called beach chair position.
Chair position, yes.
So you come in for my shoulder's been a bit bad recently, so I'm thinking about this. You go in for your shoulder surgery, and you have a general anesthetic, and then you're sat up.
Yeah.
Which means that the heart is below the brain, and where you're measuring the blood pressure may not be quite right.
Yeah.
How did you evaluate the autoregulation in those circumstances?
Well, we have some softwares, so there are different ways to measure autoregulation. The easiest way is to do a blood pressure test, for instance. Another way is to have continuous measurement using as output, according to the changes of arterial blood pressure, some surrogate of cerebral blood flow. One example is veneers. We used veneers, or we use the transcranial Doppler in some cases. With all their limitations, but they are non-invasive and they are indirect measurement of cerebral blood flow. So basically, this allows to create a correlation between changes in arterial blood pressure and changes in the surrogates. So for instance, in cerebral oxygenation or flow velocities. This correlation gives us the idea of a number, which is the optimal arterial blood pressure.
I've learned quite a lot about this since I joined BD. I knew a little bit about cerebral near-infrared spectroscopy before, but I've learned a lot more. You put your cerebral near-infrared spectroscopy on, you get your front of the brain oxygenation numbers. They're
Yes,
about
which is
70%.
surrogate of cerebral blood flow. Okay.
And your blood pressure's at a particular level. How do you decide whether to push it up or let it go down?
It depends on the clinical picture, but it depends on what happens to the cerebral oxygenation. You can do a map challenge, for instance, and see what happens to the cerebral oxygenation. Or there are also some index, some machine from BT, for instance, have the possibility to give you a cerebral autoregulation index, which already calculates for you whether in that range of blood pressure the patient is autoregulating or not.
So you put my sensors on,
Yeah.
and my SATs are 65%.
Yeah.
And my mean arterial pressure is 65.
Yeah. Then you have an increase of arterial blood pressure, which goes to 80.
Mm-hmm.
And you see what happens to the cerebral oxygenation. If it remains constant, it means that you have a constant cerebral blood flow. So it means that pressure, the brain is autoregulating properly. It's the same thing as for TCD. The difference is that for TCD, you need the training, and for NIRS, you don't.
But if it goes up with the blood pressure, then...
It means that it just follows, that the cerebral blood flow just follows the arterial blood pressure.
So I need a higher one. Is that about right? Okay. A lot of people have been talking about this for a number of years. Yourself, for example, we know the name Professor Charles Hogue, we know the name Charlie Brown, who've published, and they've sort of been telling us that if it's concordant, then you are below the lower limit of regulation. If it's discordant,
On the
then
upper.
you're probably in an okay place.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
So, in traumatic brain injury, what changes in NIRS and TCD and cerebral autoregulation are you going to typically see?
So in this population, if you look at the guidelines, the gold standard for measuring CBF as surrogate is more the ICP. So if you look at the guidelines, what they recommend is the MAP challenge to see what happens to the ICP. The concept is exactly the same. You do a MAP challenge. If the ICP goes down or remains the same, it means that the patient is autoregulating. Okay, that's the concept. And the same thing happens to flow velocity and to NIRS. Having an invasive method is a bit more precise in this case. So in TBI, what is so far recommended is the invasive ICP monitoring. Someone has also suggested invasive oxygenation. There is not huge literature on that. The application of the non-invasive ones, to me, is much more in non-brain injured patients, which doesn't mean that they might not have an alteration in autoregulation. Cardiac arrest patients, sometimes I wonder why these are not considered brain injured. No, they are generally admitted to general ICU population, but the majority of them die of cerebral edema, of cerebral complications when they are in the ICU. And there are data showing that using non-invasive monitoring in that, there are in the majority of them altered autoregulation, increased ICP, and this is correlated with outcome.
So, at this meeting in the healthcare industry area, there are lots of new monitors of various physiological and, potentially pathological parameters. And one monitor is about cerebral autoregulation. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it basically makes sure that these changes of surrogate of cerebral blood flow and arterial blood pressure are basically transformed in the easiest way possible. We are anesthetists, we are busy, we don't have time to look maybe for hours the waveforms. So what happens is that the correlation coefficient between the two parameters, the moving correlation coefficient, is just represented by the machine as a number, and it provides to you a sort of U-shaped curve where you have the targets of potential low and upper limit of autoregulation.
And you would be using NIRS?
You can use NIRS.
Arterial blood pressure, either measured invasively or non-invasively.
Yeah, it's studied with the invasive arterial blood pressure. I know there is also the possibility to have continuous non-invasive arterial blood pressure, which is fascinating to me, very fascinating. As far as I'm aware, the majority of data are with invasive.
And it's a U-shaped relationship. And what numbers does the index give us that we should be following?
The index is telling you if for a certain value of blood pressure, you have a good autoregulation or not, and where it starts to lose the autoregulation. So for instance, you might see that a patient below 60 starts to have altered autoregulation. You know that this patient has to keep above that. And then you start to see that you have a loss of autoregulation at 68. So you know that that patient has to be targeted to 60, from 60 to 68. It's precise, it's fine. It's difficult to achieve in practice.
Monty, is this technology, which actually comes from BD, is that a prelude to closed loop control of cerebral autoregulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the journey that we're all on, is that, seeking different ways of getting finer control under those circumstances. Because we're very good at it if we're concentrating really hard and it's all we have to do. But with everything else going on, if we let the machines help, we seem to get, from the research that's been done, we seem to get, smoother responses in the system.
You'd need an actuator, wouldn't you? A syringe driver with something.
And certainly research publications, that's all been done. So depth of anesthesia, blood pressure control, you can see that they crosstalk between the different physiological variables, and our objectives, what we're trying to achieve, can be automated, but we're still in control. We're just smoothing it out. Fly-by-wire or autopilot. Yeah.
Sounds good. What do you think, Chiara?
No, it's very fascinating. I think it's going to be really the future.
Are you doing any more research in this area currently, Chiara?
Yes. In this moment, I am trying to correlate all the different parameters and factors related to autoregulation together and with biomarkers. You know, the new biomarkers like
Which
NFL,
ones?
GFAP, etc. I have now a very huge interest in TBI related to changes in the city's outcome, etc. So I'm trying to correlate these with multimodal neuromonitoring and especially in subarachnoidal hemorrhage patients with idea to see whether these changes can be predictive of delayed cerebral ischemia. So we are now conducting these studies and also we are reviewing the guidelines for DCI and subarachnoidal hemorrhage with Fabio Taccone from Bruxelles. We are dealing with this huge consensus and let's see what will come out.
Europeans are good at consensus. A lot of confidence in you.
You also mentioned in passing sepsis, which
Yeah.
is the world I spent a lot of my time in, looking after those patients at the bedside. Now, the physiology all goes haywire in sepsis once it's established, and almost every organ is affected. The
Yes.
brain, almost everyone's brain seems to be a little bit abnormal for a while afterwards if they hopefully survive. But there's a lot of reasons to think the brain wouldn't be very well perfused because arterial pressures are often low.
Yeah.
Venous pressures are often very high, particularly if you have acute lung injury. And then we say you should sit the patient up at 45 degrees as part of the care of them.
Bundle.
What did you find in the sepsis?
I found that the majority of patients, if we follow the guidelines which suggest 65 millimeters of mercury of MAP, are hypoperfused in the brain.
Mm.
So if we look at also the brain needs, probably we should re-look at the targets of patients in sepsis.
Because evidence of some form of brain injury is extremely common if you look at necropsy
Super
studies.
common. Super common.
So we should revisit that.
Yeah, we should.
Is there any evidence, though, that while you're trying to manage this brain injury problem, you're doing inadvertent heart problems with other organs, like the liver and the kidneys in particular?
There is a risk, of course, of this, because if you think about a patient who might need 85 of CPP, you have different options, but at the end are fluids, and we know that positive fluid balance are bad. Even in brain injured patients, it's a false belief that positive balance in brain injured patients is fine. We all know that you need to aim to neutral one. And vasopressors, the risk of brain injury is high, so I think we should care more about the brain. Sometimes in non-brain injured patients, we monitor everything, Swan guns, invasive monitoring of every type, and then we stop at the level of the shoulders. We should start to really a head to toes assessment and monitoring of the patient. But at the same time, I think you have to balance risk and benefit.
I believe to some extent all of the major organs auto-regulate, but the lower limits of auto-regulation can vary quite a lot with age and pre-existing conditions. And the brain's at the top of the food chain and the guts at the bottom of the food chain. So I think you can quite often, as you say, rob Peter to pay Paul.
Surprised to pay.
So do you think that we'll get to a point where we use this monitoring routinely on all patients? And the reason I ask that is I was reflecting about hypertension. When I did my primary exam in the last century with Monty, we learnt about the cerebral autoregulation curve. It was always said that it was moved to the right in patients with hypertension. But when you said, well, by how much, no one knows. And in fact, the plateau in the middle is not a plateau, is it? It's a slopey line.
Yes.
And so for the anaesthetists out there who are worried about cerebral autoregulation in people with hypertension, what would be your advice?
It's difficult because my advice is to measure and to individualize it, because you might have it the curve on the right, but it can be much narrower. You can have it a bit on the left and be larger. So you don't know, honestly, if with one target you are treating properly all the patients. One size does not fit all. So if we want to know which is the right pressure, we need to measure the best, the optimal pressure.
That's really the future, isn't it? That's personalized, automated, closed loop control anesthesia with us looking over it.
Yeah.
Making sure that it's happening properly.
I think it's a fascinating discussion about the trade-off as well. Because if I was going for my shoulder surgery, for example, I have essential hypertension. So, know where my blood pressure sits. I'm now going for the surgeon who thinks I should be in beach chair. So I'm very nervous because I know too much about this.
Yeah, you studied too much.
Exactly. I would say, please use the more advanced monitoring, wherever you feel comfortable with that. And please keep my blood pressure up according to what the monitor's telling you, because I'm really worried about my brain. And if it hurts my gut for a bit, it's all right. I'll manage that post-operatively. But for this particular sprint, this 90 minutes or so, or however long it's going to take, I take that trade-off. Other circumstances in chronic critical illness, I might take a different trade-off. But
Yeah, I think I would have said the same thing.
It's interesting, though, because you've brought up another element which doesn't always get heard, which is what's the patient's opinion about what they most value? And nearly everyone would say, I value my brain. I remember when we released the results of the POISE study, and we showed that beta blockers prevent perioperative myocardial infarction, but they're associated with a higher risk of stroke. And every patient, you go, well, would you rather have a heart attack or a stroke? And 100% of them say they would rather have a heart attack.
So I'm overly informed and overly opinionated about this. So I'd say, really, please look after my brain. I'm expecting to be sick post-operatively because you've done horrible things to my guts to keep my brain happy. But I'll manage that because I'm prepared for that trade-off. It's like seasickness on a long voyage. And then I'll probably get an ileus when I start eating, but I'm prepared to manage that because that's my trade-off. Yeah.
Exactly. So what's coming up for you at the rest of the conference, Chiara?
I have talks until 6 p.m. So
Really?
It's going to be a very busy day, yes.
What else are you talking about?
Brain, always brain.
Excellent. And when are you going home to Genova?
Tomorrow evening, yes.
It won't take you very long to get there, though, will it?
Oh, it's 3 hours.
Yeah.
3 hours, yes. But I have to go back because my daughter has a dance show on Wednesday. So, mom has to be there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a great pleasure. You'll be able to find this interview on our app, our website, and on social media. We're on Facebook, X, we're now on Blue Sky, and we're also on YouTube. And if you go there, please subscribe and give us a big thumbs up. Finally, we'd like to thank Isaac for their hospitality and our sponsors, BD, and also GE, without whom we couldn't bring Top Med Talk free and open access to the world. See you next time.
Thank you.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Also, it's important to remember that Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EPPOM, evidence-based perioperative medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is eppom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. eppom.org.